If you are watching this and you are hallucinating, paranoid, disorganized, suicidal, violent, or you cannot track consequence, this is not a philosophical debate. This is not a mythic story. This is a safety issue. Get help, talk to someone qualified, get support in your real world. And if you're in immediate danger, call emergency services. I am not a doctor or a psychiatrist. This is not medical advice. This is not a replacement for clinical care. Now, I need to say the opposite just as clearly. This is not a video where I romanticize madness. I have lived close enough to the edge to know you do not get any points for staying there. You either come back or you don't. And I'm making this because modern culture has two equally dangerous habits. It either pathologizes everything or, on the other hand, romanticizes everything. And both kill people. So I'm going to try to do something rare. I'm going to tell the truth in a way that holds the full complexity of the situation. The spiritual language and the real world consequences. The symbolic and the criminal. The mercy and the responsibility. The beauty and the damage. Because if I told this story without the line, it would be dangerous. And if I told it without meaning, it would be dead. This is a map for anyone who has walked near this edge or watched someone else walk near it. And for those who need something sober to reference when everything gets confusing, let's begin where we have to begin. There are two kinds of madness that humanity has always known. And the danger has never been that we fail to name them. The danger is that we confuse them, especially when the stakes are high. The first kind is a biological kind of madness. It arises from the nervous system itself. Genetics, injury, neurological disruption, developmental fracture, trauma that overwhelms the brain's capacity to integrate reality. This kind of madness does not carry meaning in the symbolic sense. It carries symptoms: disorganization, hallucination, delusion, loss of coherence, inability to track consequence, inability to regulate emotion or behavior, inability to return to baseline. And when that happens, the correct response is not myth. It's care, protection, rehabilitation. Sometimes even medication, sometimes hospitalization, sometimes boundaries enforced from the outside, because in those times the inside cannot hold itself. I want to say this plainly. To spiritualize biological psychosis is not compassion. It is negligence. Negligence is what happens when you call a fire a blessing while it is still burning down the house and tearing people's lives apart. Now, there is a second kind, and it's older than psychiatry, older than diagnosis, older than hospitals. It is the initiatory madness. And before anyone gets excited, I need to say what it is not. This is not a trendy idea. This is not anesthetic. This is not a permission to slip into the unstable. Initiatory madness is what happens when the psyche is subjected to pressure beyond the identity's capacity, but not beyond the soul's. It appears at thresholds: puberty, death proximity, spiritual rupture, trauma that breaks the existing self, ancestral breaking points, moments where a life cannot continue in its current form. But here is the part modern culture does not want to hold. Initiatory madness is not benign. It is dangerous. Dangerous to the individual. Dangerous to the community. Dangerous to the boundary between worlds, if you believe in that language. Dangerous to the boundary between inner reality and outer reality, even if you don't. And ancient cultures did not romanticize this kind of madness. They did not applaud it. They did not let it run free. They contained it. Because initiatory madness must be held, or it will destroy. Modern culture lost the distinction. So now we do the worst possible thing. We either pathologize everything, or we romanticize everything. And both are forms of utter blindness. And blindness at the edges we're speaking about kills people. Here is the core of the whole episode. Not everything that looks spiritual is safe. Not everything that looks pathological is meaningless. And if you can't hold both, you cannot walk this edge. Ancient societies did not ask, is this madness good or bad? They asked something more brutal, more accurate. They asked, can this person be held? Not held as in liked, not held as in validated, held as in contained. Can this person be surrounded by structure? Can their nervous system stabilize under such containment? Can they be guided? Can they be stopped when they go too far? Can they integrate what is happening, even slowly? If the answer was no, they were restrained, isolated, removed, sometimes exiled, not as punishment, as protection. Because the village matters too. If the answer was yes, the initiate was taken out of the village, never kept inside it. because initiation does not happen in the marketplace. It is not a public affair. It does not happen among children. It does not happen among the unprepared. It happens in forests, deserts, mountains, caves, monasteries, fire circles, under supervision. And here is the truth modern spirituality refuses to say out loud. Not everyone survived initiation. Modern culture erased discernment and replaced it with ideology. Either all madness is sickness, or all madness is awakening. Both are lies, and lies that become lethal at the edges. A lot of people imagine ancient cultures as either cruel or naively spiritual. But intact cultures were rarely naive about the edge. They were conservative about it. They had laws. They had boundaries. They had consequences. Because when someone loses reality testing, you don't just get a poetic story. You get unpredictable behavior. And unpredictability is dangerous. So the ancient world didn't worship the initiate. It tested the initiate. It measured them. And the measure was not vibes. It was outcomes, capacity, responsiveness, integration, and most importantly, can he be stopped? Because if a man cannot be stopped, he is not an initiate. He is a risk. And the line between those two is where people die. Now I'm going to move into lived experience. And I'm going to do it soberly. Because if I tell this in a way that makes chaos look holy, someone else will copy the chaos. And I refuse to do that. So everything I say from here forward sits inside one law. Spiritual meaning does not cancel consequence. There are experiences that happen before language, before story, before ego, before ambition. A child lying in a cot. No theology, no self-concept, no myth, just continuity. A felt sense that life did not begin here and would not end here. A sense that something was being continued, not started. As an adult, I named it picking up the cosmic baton. But the experience itself was pre-language. And this is where I need to be precise. That kind of knowing does not automatically mean specialness, mission, chosenness, exemption from consequence. It means sensitivity. It means permeability. Some people come in with thick skin. Some people come in with thin skin. Thin skin can become medicine or it can become rupture. And the world is not gentle with porous boys. Porous boys feel more. They register more. They absorb more. And if they are not taught containment early, they learn disassociation instead. They learn to disappear inside of themselves. They learn to cope by leaving their body. So the thread does not start with destiny. It starts with capacity. And capacity without containment is not a gift. It is vulnerability. The danger begins when continuity gets interpreted. When the child grows, acquires language, absorbs culture, absorbs shame, absorbs repression, and the knowing gets wrapped in identity. Then the fire no longer warms, it starts to burn. This is the origin point for a lot of men who later walk this edge. Not because they were chosen, because they were open. And openness without structure becomes exposure. I need to name one of the earliest turning points. After I began using marijuana, around the onset of anxiety, panic attacks, social withdrawal, I had something like a vision, a dream, a knowing, a message. It told me I needed to become mad. It told me the life I needed to live could not come into being unless I was consumed by the fire of madness. And I also need to tell the darker truth that sat underneath that. I was struggling with sexuality, and there was a belief, spoken or unspoken, that it was better to be mad than to be gay or bisexual. I'm not going to clean that up because this is where initiation pressure and pathology get braided, not as theory, as lived reality. If a young man is carrying shame that he cannot metabolize, shame around desire, identity, belonging, the psyche will look for an escape route. The psyche is not moral, it is adaptive. It chooses what feels survivable. Sometimes that route is addiction. Sometimes it's spiritual inflation. Sometimes it's disassociation. Sometimes it's collapse. Sometimes it's madness. A vision like that can be real and still be misread because the psyche translates in primitive language. If I destroy the self I hate, I will be free. But destruction is not initiation. Initiation is disassembly under supervision. Initiation is stripping without annihilation. Initiation is descent with return as the point. Without supervision, descent becomes collapse. And collapse does not teach. It traumatizes. So, when I say I needed to become mad, here is the more precise translation. I needed to lose the identity that could not carry what I was here to carry. But because there were no elders, because there was no containment, because there was no culture that knew what to do with young male fire, I entered the underworld without a rope tied to my waist. You can survive that, but you can also die there. And the fact that I didn't is not a badge of honor. It is mercy. And that vision wasn't just a dramatic idea. It became a decade, a lived initiation, addiction, psychosis, prison, death work, plant medicine, spiritual emergence, carried through years of travel and life across 6 continents. There was no guarantee I'd return. And the past decade tested everything. It tested my mind. It tested my relationships. It tested my integrity. It tested my body. Another thread that ran through this was dreams. When initiatory pressure rises, symbolic energy rises. Archetypes flood the psyche. And when symbolic energy floods a nervous system without containment, it inflates the psyche. Not always because a man is arrogant, but the moment symbolic content is treated as entitlement, the moment inner imagery is treated as proof of outer status, the line is crossed. This is where spiritual emergence becomes dangerous. Not because the spiritual is fake, because the psyche is hungry. Hungry for meaning. Hungry for significance. Hungry to turn pain into importance. And if that hunger is not disciplined, it becomes grandiosity, which is not sovereignty. It is a survival strategy dressed in gold. And this is one of the great tests, because the visions can feel holy. They can feel ordained. They can feel like a calling. But visions don't prove maturity. Integration does. If you're watching this and you've had visions like that, I'm not here to humiliate you. I'm here to keep you alive. A vision is not a crown. A vision is a pressure signal. And pressure needs containment. There were many times throughout this process where I was assessed by mental health organizations. And there was a moment that repeated itself so many times that it is burned into me. I would speak about the spiritual quest. I would speak about the spiritual work. I would speak about the spiritual war, the spiritual attacks, and the sense of being pulled into something bigger than me. And I would watch the clinician's eyes glaze, not because they are evil, because they are trained. They are calculating terminology, risk, liability, diagnosis, medication, and I could see it. I could feel it. This is where the fracture becomes real. Because some of what I was trying to describe was symbolic truth. My psyche using mythic language to describe trauma, to describe nervous system collapse, to describe addiction pressure, to describe archetypal overload. But I also have to be honest. Some of what I was describing at times was delusion. And the problem is the system often does not distinguish. It doesn't say your symbolic language can carry meaning, but your behavior needs containment. It often moves toward this language is in and of itself evidence. So you get pathologized, not just for symptoms, but for cosmology. And if you are already sensitive, already ashamed, already unstable, being treated like a risk protocol can make you worse. Because psychiatry is not designed for initiation pressure. It is designed for symptom reduction. And sometimes symptom reduction is life-saving. Sometimes medication is necessary. Sometimes hospitalization saves a life. I'm not here to deny or dispute that. But if you reduce everything to pathology, you erase meaning. And erasing meaning can break a man in a different way. So you stand on a tightrope. If you speak spiritually, you are labeled. If you speak clinically, you feel like you are lying. And this is the razor's edge. The fine line between pathologizing and initiation, between danger and unfolding, between breakdown and growth, between the lotus and the mud. This is one of the reasons I am making this video. Because I know there are men out there right now trying to explain what is happening to them. And I know that no language fits. No language makes sense of this. No language does the job. And when no language fits, men either isolate or men either spiral, or men either self-medicate, or men either become dangerous to themselves and to their communities. So I am trying to give a language that holds reality, not romance, not flattening, reality. Now we move into substances. And I need to be careful here because this is one of the most misunderstood parts of my story and our collective story. I smoked cannabis and tobacco almost continuously since adolescence. From early teenage years and during certain periods of the past decade, India, Nepal, highly charged spiritual environments, delusions of grandeur intensified. Then I went to Thailand. I smoked more, stronger weed, and there was more access to it. And yet the intensity shifted and toned down. That matters because it tells us something specific. Cannabis is not always the cause. It is often the amplifier. Some people tolerate it, some people don't. And if you have had psychosis adjacent symptoms before, it's a totally different risk profile. Cannabis lowers ego boundaries. It increases associative thinking. It weakens reality testing in vulnerable nervous systems. It can intensify paranoia, grandiosity, disassociation. In some people, it calms them. In others, it opens doors that should never be opened without containment or supervision. And when cannabis is combined with sleep deprivation, long-term travel strain, unresolved trauma, sexual shame, spiritual intensity, symbolic environments, lack of elders, lack of limits, you do not get relaxation. You get threshold pressure. And threshold pressure without containment becomes a storm. This is why the environment matters. India and Nepal can be saturated with symbolic charge. Temples, deities, lineages, ritual, devotion, death proximity. And if you are already porous, already spiritually hungry, already destabilized, already using cannabis as an amplifier, those environments don't just inspire you, they can flood you. Thailand, for me, functioned more like rest. Less archetypal pressure, more grounding through pleasure, food, massage, human rhythm and contact, same substance abuse, different container, different outcome. This distinction is essential because without it, people turn cannabis into either a demon or a sacrament. And it is neither. It is an amplifier. And amplifiers require engineers, not romantics. And if you are watching this and you are using cannabis while you are unstable, hear me when I say this. If you are getting paranoid, grandiose, disorganized, sleepless, obsessive, or you cannot track consequence. That is not a badge of spirituality. That is your nervous system telling you it cannot hold what you are feeding it. Stop treating warning signs as proof of destiny. Now we reach the place where everything converged. Jagannath Puri, the Bay of Bengal, the ancient pilgrimage town, India's East Gate, the deities known as the Lords of the Universe, a place saturated with devotion, death, ritual, and myth. I had been traveling for months across continents. My nervous system was exhausted. I was smoking cannabis daily. I was sleep deprived. I was immersed in symbolic environments. And I was carrying unprocessed shame, identity fracture, and spiritual hunger. I arrived in Puri with a sense that I needed to be there one last time, not as a tourist, as a threshold. I stayed with a friend and his son, kind people, devotees of Lord Krishna. And then I checked myself into Tota Gopinath temple. This is the only temple in the world where Lord Krishna is seated. The fact that I was allowed to stay felt incredibly auspicious. It felt full of meaning. And this is where I need to be extremely clear. Meaning does not equal safety. I began taking bhang daily, a cannabis paste traditionally used in ritual contexts. I began visiting the burning ghats every day. I volunteered with the fire boys who burn the bodies. I stood close to death every day and night. I felt liberation there, freedom, a sense of transcendence. And this is when I also began to fracture. Because when you combine daily intoxication, sleep deprivation, death proximity, symbolic saturation, lack of supervision, lack of elders, lack of limits, you do not get initiation. You get boundary collapse. I became erratic, unstable. I tied myself to a lamppost in a psychotic state. That was not symbolic theatre. That was loss of reality testing. I was taken to a local police station. I was spoken to. I was sent home. And then the next day, I crossed a line. Foreigners are forbidden from entering the Jagannath temple, the ancient East Gate of India pilgrimage site. I knew this. I had circumambulated that temple dozens of times over the years. But in that state, intoxicated, grandiose, fractured, I decided to enter. I dressed in a way that reflected my inner state. Mythic, otherworldly, totally ungrounded. I slipped past guards through the western gate. I entered the inner compound. And when my identity was finally discovered, I was surrounded by the local devout priests. I was beaten. That was not ritual ordeal. That was consequence. A plain-clothed police officer approached me. He told me to calm down. He reassured me that he would help me in that situation. He wore a gold chain around his neck, and in a moment of total madness, believing I was making an offering, believing if I were to die at that moment, my death would be in service, I ripped the gold chain from his neck. That was not devotion. That was delusion. I was beaten again, escorted out, photographed by the local media, taken to the police station. I held onto that gold chain as if it were my salvation in this life and the next, as if it were my offering, as if it were my ticket to the afterlife. That is how far reality testing had collapsed. Later, when the officer arrived at the station, I returned the gold chain to him. There was a stunned silence. Not because I was holy, because the situation was completely unstable. I was told to wait. Then I panicked. I ran from the police station. During the scuffle, my hand smashed through a glass window. Shards of glass embedded deep into my left palm, the side closest to my heart. Blood poured onto the road. I was chased down, tackled, taken to hospital. 6 officers held me down while a surgeon removed glass from my hand without anesthetic. That was not purification. That was trauma. Pain beyond description. Afterwards, the police commissioner came. I was released, not because I was innocent, because the situation was incredibly complex. I had broken boundaries. I had been injured. I was a foreign national. I returned to my friend's house. I continued self-medicating. And here is where things become subtle and dangerous. The police were concerned. They arranged for officers to follow me. On one level, this was care. On another level, it fed my delusions. I felt important. I felt protected. I felt significant. They drove me places. They spoke kindly to me. And kindness without clarity can inflate delusion. I tested their words. I went to a gold shop. I asked them to buy me gold chains. When they refused, I smashed the shop window with a brick I found lying on the road. That was not symbolism. That was criminal damage. I was detained again, this time sedated, held in an Indian psych ward for 2 nights. I smashed windows in that psych ward too. Not expression, dysregulation. Eventually, due to family intervention and diplomatic pressure, I was released. The police commissioner and the head monk of Tota Gopinath temple transported me back to the temple. They allowed me to sleep by the altar. They cared for me. They even drove me to buy more cannabis. I still had glass in my hand. I was in pain. I needed surgery. They drove me to the airport. I returned to the UK. And I need to say this clearly. None of this was sacred permission. None of this was destiny proving itself. This was what happens when uncontained fire meets fragile systems. Spiritual meaning did not cancel consequence. I was just incredibly fortunate and lucky to survive this ordeal. When I returned to the UK, the adrenaline wore off. That's when the cost arrived. Not in visions, not in meaning, in the body. My hand was swollen, stiff, and damaged. Glass had been embedded deep in the palm. I couldn't grip anything properly. I couldn't close my fist. I couldn't forget what had happened, even for a moment. Every movement reminded me that this was not symbolic. This was not mythic. This was not initiation language. It was physical. It was real. It had consequences. Sleep didn't come easily. When it did, it was shallow. Images replayed themselves without permission. The chase, the glass, the blood, the restraint, not as visions, as memory. I went into surgery under full anesthetic. The glass this time was removed properly. The wound was cleaned, stitched, stabilized, and for a moment there was relief. Not spiritual relief, not existential relief, nervous system relief. The kind that comes when the body finally stops screaming. And this is where many people misunderstand recovery. They think relief is resolution. It isn't. Relief just means the immediate danger has passed. It does not mean the pattern has ended. Because while my hand was stabilized, my psyche was not. I was still porous, still flooded, still chasing meaning, still confusing intensity with truth, still using cannabis to regulate states I did not know how to regulate sober. From the outside, I looked calm. I could speak coherently again. I could hold conversations. I could sit quietly. I could even sound wise if someone asked the right questions. Inside, I was still fragmented. This is the most dangerous phase. Not the crisis, the aftermaths. Because when the obvious danger passes, the mind wants to declare victory. It wants to say, I survived this. I am fine now. That was the initiation. I got through it. I drifted toward another spiritual environment. Another temple offering solace and connection. Another container that felt safe enough to hold me, but not structured enough to change me. I wandered London listening to kirtan. I spent hours walking without direction. I let sound carry me because silence felt too exposed. From the outside, this looked peaceful. From the inside, it was avoidance dressed as devotion. I wasn't grounding. I was hovering. And hovering feels better than falling. But it's still not standing. This is the trap no one warns you about. When you survive intensity, ordinary life can feel completely unbearable. The nervous system has been trained to regulate itself through charge, through danger, meaning, urgency, transcendence. So when things go quiet, the body doesn't interpret that as safety. It interprets it as emptiness. And emptiness can feel like death. I got sober for a month, just long enough to feel clarity. Not long enough to feel stability and build stability. Clarity without structure is brittle. It shows you what's possible and then drops you back into old habits when the weight arrives. And then I returned to India again. Not because I wanted chaos, because the nervous system remembered intensity as home. This is the truth that matters. Repetition is not initiation. It is compulsion. And compulsion does not care about meaning. It only cares about relief. Relief from flatness. Relief from shame. Relief from the slow work of rebuilding a self that can stand without fire. At that stage, I still didn't know how to live without intensity. I didn't yet know how to regulate myself without substances. I didn't know how to sit in the aftermath without reaching for the next threshold. I didn't know how to accept that what I needed was not another descent into the underworld. What I needed was restraint. That understanding hadn't arrived yet. And until it does, the cycle repeats. Not because a man is foolish, but because his nervous system hasn't yet learned another language. I need to speak about the fire again. but this time with the line intact. This was with the Yawanaway tribe of the Amazon basin, an intact lineage, ancestral holders of ayahuasca, people who carry responsibility, not aesthetics. This was not a retreat run by influencers. This was not a spiritual playground. This was not a place where instability is reframed as insight. This was ceremony held by elders who understand consequence. By the time I arrived, I was already carrying instability, sleep disruption, residual psychosis, a nervous system that hadn't settled, a psyche that still confused intensity with truth. I was functional, I was articulate, but I was not integrated. During ceremony, the pressure rose. Not dramatically at first, subtly. Heat, meaning, urgency. The familiar internal logic returned. This is surrender. This is offering. This is how you complete it. And beneath that language was something more primitive. An impulse towards annihilation. A belief that giving the body completely was the deepest and highest devotion. A belief that disappearance was holiness. And in that state, I moved toward the fire. On one level, the impulse felt symbolic. On another level, it was unmistakably dangerous. And here is the part that matters. No one praised it. No one encouraged it. No one interpreted it as holy. No one tried to find meaning in it. I was stopped from entering the fire physically, firmly, immediately, without drama, without discussion, without mythology. Not punished, not shamed, not exiled. Stopped, surrounded, contained, held. Because in intact cultures, fire is not a metaphor. Fire is law. The body is not yours to destroy as a spiritual gesture. Ever. Fire teaches limits. It does not erase them. And real elders do not celebrate self-destruction. They intervene. Because initiation seeks return. Not disappearance. Not sacrifice of the body. Not ego death mistaken for physical death. In that moment, something crucial happened. For the first time in years, intensity did not get interpreted. It got contained. And that containment was not experienced as oppression. It was experienced as relief. Because somewhere beneath the madness, the system wanted to be stopped. They knew the difference instantly between transformation and collapse, between surrender and annihilation, between devotion and dysregulation. That distinction saved me, because without it, I would have kept mistaking danger for devotion. I would have kept interpreting loss of control as truth. I would have kept believing that the more extreme the act, the more sacred it was. That belief nearly killed me. This is what intact cultures understand, that modern spirituality often forgets. Not everything intense is initiatory. Not everything overwhelming is meaningful. Not everything that feels sacred is safe. Fire does not crown you. Fire tests you. And if you cannot be stopped, you are not an initiate. You are a risk. That moment with the Yawanawa tribe did not complete anything. It interrupted something. It broke the spell that said, if it feels holy, it must be right. And that interruption mattered more than any vision I've ever had, because it reintroduced law, and law is what makes return possible. Up until now, I've been trying to hold complexity. I've been saying there are experiences that can carry symbolic meaning, and there are states that are pure nervous system collapse, and sometimes they overlap, and sometimes the language is confusing, and sometimes culture has no container, and sometimes a man ends up walking an edge without supervision. But this is where the comfort ends. Because the question that comes next is brutal. It's the question that decides whether spirituality becomes wisdom or whether it becomes a weapon. The question is this: if breakdown can sometimes carry meaning, if madness can sometimes be initiatory, if the underworld can sometimes return medicine, then where is the line? Is everything a part of nature? Is everything karmic? Is everything God's will? And then the mind goes darker, because it has to. What about murder? What about rape? What about suicide? What about violence, abuse, coercion, predation? What about sacrifice that harms other people? What about the kind of chaos that destroys families? What about the kind of madness that leaves bodies behind? If I don't answer that clearly, then this whole video is dangerous. Let me get more precise, because people try to get clever here. They try to say, but isn't everything part of nature? But if God is sovereign, doesn't God allow everything? But what about karma? What about fate? Listen carefully. There are philosophical arguments you can make about the universe. And then there is the reality of ethics. And ethics is not an intellectual exercise. Ethics is what stops humans from becoming beasts. Ethics is what protects children. Ethics is what protects women. Ethics is what protects the vulnerable. Ethics is what protects society from men who cannot be stopped. And this is why ancient cultures, intact cultures, lineages were not naive about the edge. They were conservative about it. They had rights, yes. They also had boundaries. They had consequences. They had elders with authority. They had law. And even when they interpreted some experiences as spiritual, they did not interpret harm as holy. They did not interpret predation as initiation. They did not interpret violence as a divine right. They measured outcomes. They watched behavior. They looked for one thing above all. Can he be held? Can he be stopped? So, what are the metrics? How do you tell the difference between initiatory pressure and the difference between madness? I'm going to give you a sober set of rails. Not perfect, not absolute, but useful nonetheless. The first rail is harm. Not vibes, not energy, not visions, harm. Are you harming yourself in ways that are escalating and out of control? Are you harming others? Are you causing fear? Are you violating boundaries? Are you damaging property? Are you behaving in ways where other people are not safe around you? That matters. Because spiritual meaning does not cancel consequence. Ever. Second, repeat pattern. One-off incidents happen in crisis, but repetition reveals structure. If you keep escalating, if you keep crossing lines, if you keep returning to the same dangerous behavior, that is not a one-time initiation. That is a pattern, and patterns require intervention. Third rail, response to guidance. This one is huge. If someone says, stop, can you stop? If someone says, come here, can you come? If someone says, you are not safe right now, can you receive it? Because initiatory pressure can be intense. But a person who can be guided is still reachable. A person who cannot be guided is not. And that is where restraint becomes necessary. Fourth rail, reality testing. Are you tracking consequence? Are you aware of what your actions will do? Do you understand time? Do you understand risk? Do you understand what the police are? Do you understand what law is? Do you understand what happens if you hurt someone? Or are you living in a mythic bubble where consequences don't apply to you? That is not enlightenment. That is danger. Fifth rail, sleep and self-care. This sounds basic, but it matters. If you can't sleep, if you are not eating, if you are not drinking water, if you are not caring for your body, if you are running on adrenaline and meaning, you are not in spiritual mastery. You are in nervous system collapse. Sixth rail, containment capacity. Can you stay in one place? Can you keep routines? Can you accept structure? Can you accept boundaries? If structure makes you feel oppressed in the middle of instability, that is a big warning sign, because when a mind is unstable, structure is untold mercy, not prison. Part of why this topic is so dangerous is because I know what it feels like to be inside a state where everything is charged with meaning, a state where everything feels like God, a state where everything feels like destiny, and yet your behavior becomes unpredictable. And the terrifying thing is, from the inside, it doesn't feel like danger. It can feel like truth. It can feel like liberation. It can feel like finally I am free. But freedom without consequence is not freedom. It is disassociation. It is mania. It is delusion. And the world does not care what your story is. Fire does not care. Glass does not care. Police do not care. The court system does not care. Gravity does not care. The body does not care. People hear stories of awakening, and they mistake warning signs for callings. They mistake destabilization for destiny. They mistake danger for divinity. And then they copy it. And they don't return. I am not here to flatter the myth. I am here to hold the line that keeps people alive and helps people return. Because once you start harming others, or you start justifying harm, you have left initiation. You have entered delusion, and you must be stopped. That is not lack of compassion. That is compassion that includes everyone, not just you, because the village matters too. Now, this brings us to the question underneath all questions. The one that I ask myself in the darkest nights. What if I wasn't just ill? What if I was doing something necessary? What if I was carrying something for the world? What if the madness was purifying karma that was mine and not mine? What if I was taking on a load for humanity and making it lighter for everyone here? I'm going to answer this carefully because there is a piece of truth in it. And there is also a piece of danger in it. The piece of truth is that humans do carry collective weight. We inherit trauma. We inherit family patterns. We inherit cultural distortions. We inherit history. And some people are more porous than others. Some people feel the whole room. Some people feel the whole generation. Some people feel the whole lineage. That is real. But the piece of danger is the moment you turn that into entitlement, the moment you turn that into immunity, the moment you turn that into a story where you don't have to obey the law, you become unsafe. So here is the sober version. Maybe you are sensitive. Maybe you are porous. Maybe you do carry more than you can name. But if the way you carry it harms people, you still have to stop. And if you can't stop, you have to be stopped. That is the line. And the line does not move. Not for God. Not for karma. Not for destiny. Not for initiation. And now we can go further. Because once that line is held, we can speak honestly about the rest. Here is the paradox that only makes sense after survival. In my case, after over a decade in the labyrinth. Addiction, psychosis, humiliation, prison, death work, plant medicine, spiritual emergence, breakdowns that nearly killed me. I came out the other side with something I did not have before. Ground, sobriety, containment, a spine, a center, sovereignty. So the mind asks, was the madness the medicine? Was it necessary? Was it destined? Was it good? I'm going to tell you the truth without romance. Madness is not the medicine. Survival is. Return is. And integration is. The underworld is not a teacher by itself. The underworld is an environment. It strips you. It humbles you. It humiliates you. It breaks your identity. But it does not automatically heal you. Some people go into the underworld and become worse. Some people go into the underworld and become predators. Some people go into the underworld and die. Some people go into the underworld and never return. So the underworld is not medicine. The underworld is a place where you are tested. And the medicine, if it comes from what you choose afterwards. The medicine comes from taking responsibility, restoring boundaries, getting sober, honoring reality, repairing what can be repaired, accepting consequences, and refusing to cross the line again. That is the medicine. So when I say that madness became medicine for me, what I really mean is the consequences forged a man who stopped bargaining. They burned off grandiosity. They burned off the fantasy that I could live outside law. They burned off the need to be seen as special. They burned off the idea that pain automatically makes you wise. And what was left after enough humiliation and fear and loss was something raw, human, sober, and strangely strong. Not because I won, because I survived. And survival is not a slogan. Survival is earned. Survival is paid for. Survival has a cost. And I need to say something else here. There is a temptation people have, especially spiritually inclined people, to rewrite the past, to make it neat, to make it worth it, to say it was all perfect. No, some of it was stupid. Some of it was reckless. Some of it was harmful. Some of it was traumatizing. Some of it was avoidable. And the mature move is not to romanticize the mess. The mature move is to tell the truth about the mess, and then tell the truth about what it demanded. Because when you tell the truth about what it demanded, you create a map. And maps save lives. This is also where we need to talk about a phrase that appears in spiritual circles. The lotus grows from the mud. It is true, but people say it like it is pretty. They say it like it is poetry. Let me tell you what it feels like when you are actually in mud. When you are deep enough that you cannot see the surface. When you do not have a spine. When you do not have a center. When you are not heroic. You are infantile, lost, reduced to mush. When I use the word wormhole, I mean that. A place beneath dignity. A place beneath identity. A place beneath narrative. You do not know how to return. You do not know what day it is. You do not know who you are. You do not know what is real. And you are trying to rebuild from a place that feels like nothing. That is the mud. And when you are there, the lotus line does not feel inspiring. It feels like a joke. Because you do not feel like a lotus. You feel like you have been erased. So what heals? Not the mud, not the chaos, not the breakdown. What heals is when you begin, slowly, painfully, awkwardly, to rebuild yourself, to get a spine again, to get a center again, to tell the truth again, to stop self-medicating, to stop running, to stop pretending your instability is sacred, to accept containment, to accept limits, to accept that your body is not an altar for destruction, to accept that your life is not yours to throw away for symbolism. That is what heals. And the reason I'm saying this is because some men out there right now are secretly in love with the idea of madness. They want the badge. They want the myth. They want the identity of the one who went to the edge. And they do not understand the cost. So I'm going to say it plainly. If you are craving madness as proof of spiritual seriousness, you are not ready for initiation. You are hungry for significance. And significance hunger is a deadly trap. Initiation is not a badge. Initiation is a stripping. And you might not return. And I'm not saying that to scare you. I'm saying it because it is true. There were points in my life where I really nearly did not return. This is not exaggeration. This is not drama. This is not content. This is fact. And if I speak about this without that undeniable truth, I am lying to myself and I am lying to you. So no, madness is not the medicine. Madness is the fire. And fire can cook food, or it can burn down the house. The medicine is learning to use fire without burning people. The medicine is containment restored. Now, we need to go into the next layer because it's one of the hardest. Forgiveness, karma, and accountability. There is a spiritual bypass that destroys integrity. It sounds spiritual, it sounds compassionate, it sounds enlightened, and it is poison. It is the idea that the people I harmed were just tools for each other's karma. Or the people who harmed me were just playing their role. Or it was all meant to happen. Or God planned it, so nobody is responsible. Listen carefully. There is a difference between meaning and moral bypass. There is a difference between mystery and excuse. There is a difference between forgiveness and rewriting. If I harmed people, their suffering was real. If people harmed me, my suffering was real. And nobody gets erased in the name of spirituality. Nobody becomes a prop. Nobody becomes a character in my myth. They were people. They are people. And integrity demands that you hold that. So what about forgiveness? What about redemption? What about the phoenix from the ashes? What about creating healing later? Does it write off the past? No. Healing later does not retroactively justify harm. Doing good later does not delete what happened. Spiritual insight does not erase consequence. What it can do is something different. It can transform what you do with the weight. Because a man who survives this edge has a choice. He can inflate. He can say, look what I went through. Look how special I am. Or he can collapse. He can say, I am unforgivable. I should despair. I should die. Both are traps. Inflation is the trap of grandiosity. Collapse is the trap of shame. An initiation, real initiation, produces something else. It produces a man who can carry weight without theatre. A man who can say, I did wrong. I harmed. I was unstable. I crossed untold lines. And I am responsible for repairing what I can repair. And I accept what I cannot repair. And I will not do it again. That is adult spirituality. Not the airy stuff. Not the bypass. Adult spirituality. Let's go a little bit deeper and address another part of this matrix. What blade of grass can move without God? What can live or die without God? Is anything outside divine permission? This is where things get tricky. Because yes, if you believe a sovereign God, then nothing is outside of this God. Nothing is outside nature. Nothing is outside the field. And here is what that does not mean. It does not mean you are not responsible. It does not mean your choices do not matter. It does not mean harm is holy. It does not mean that you get to turn darkness into destiny. It does not mean the devil, inner or outer, becomes your excuse. Because the minute you start using God to dissolve responsibility, you become a spiritual child. And spiritual children become dangerous when they are in adult bodies. So what about the devil? What about malevolent forces? Do they have power? Are we puppets? Here is the sober answer. Maybe and possibly forces exist. Maybe the psyche has shadows that feel like entities. Maybe spiritual warfare is real in ways we can't even begin to measure. But even if all of that is true, your responsibility remains. Your responsibility is what you do with your life. Your responsibility is where you place your body. Your responsibility is what substances you take. Your responsibility is who you harm. Your responsibility is whether you stop. Adulthood means you don't get to disappear into myth. You do not get to vanish into God did it. You do not get to blame demons for your choices. You do not get to excuse harm as being an agent of karma. You have to stand in your life. You have to become accountable. And here is where forgiveness becomes real. Forgiveness is not erasure. Forgiveness is the possibility of transformation. Forgiveness is what allows a man to carry his past without being imprisoned by it, while still refusing to rewrite it as holy. Forgiveness is what makes repair possible. Forgiveness is what makes service possible. But service does not delete consequence. Service is what you do after consequence. And that is the only honest redemption. Now we go into the next layer. One that most people do not talk about, but the one that they feel. The toe-curling cringe. The social death. The being seen in states you cannot unsee. And then trying to live afterwards. This is one of the hidden costs of walking near this edge. Because when people talk about awakening or initiation, they tend to focus on meaning. They tend to focus on visions. They tend to focus on the poetic framing. But the reality is more human. When you are disorganized, paranoid, grandiose, unpredictable, when you are in psychosis or near psychosis, when you are behaving in ways that frighten people, you don't just lose your mind, you lose social trust, you lose reputation, you lose the version of yourself that used to be relied upon. You lose the ability to create how you are perceived. And some people never see you cleanly again because they met you when you were divided. And that leaves an imprint. Let me say it plainly. Who wants to be around someone in deep psychosis? Who wants to be around someone who feels unsafe? Who wants to be around someone whose reality testing is compromised? Most people do not. And they are not wrong for that, because unpredictability is not romantic. It is frightening. Unpredictability can be dangerous, even if you are not trying to harm anyone. Your nervous system might still be making you unsafe. So people naturally create distance. They pull away. They protect themselves and their interests. And a part of you might want to call that lack of compassion. But a mature man learns to accept something sobering. People are not obligated to stay close to chaos, especially if they have been burned by it. This is one of the most painful parts of recovery, because after you survive, after you come back, after you start rebuilding, You want the world to recognize the new you. You want the world to say, I see you now. I see your growth. But some people cannot. Their nervous system associates you with danger, with instability, with fear, with shame, with confusion. And you do not get to demand that they update their image of you. You cannot force it. You cannot argue it. You cannot philosophize your way into social trust. Trust is rebuilt through time, through consistency, through humility, through stability, through showing up again and again without recognition. And this is where many men break after survival. Not during the madness, after, because they come back into sobriety and they realize what they did, and they remember the faces, and they remember the cringe, and they remember what people saw, and the shame hits like a ton of bricks. And shame is dangerous because shame can drive you back into collapse. Shame can drive you back into substances. Shame can drive you back into self-destruction. Shame can drive you back into a fantasy where you'd rather be mad than be ordinary. So I need to name this. If you are in recovery from something like this, you have to learn to carry being misunderstood. You have to learn to carry being remembered incorrectly. You have to learn to carry the fact that some doors close forever. And that grief is not spiritual. It is human. Let me bring this into my own life. And that reveals something uncomfortable. Approval is unstable. Always. Sometimes the people closest to you cannot see you clearly. Sometimes the people far away can. And sometimes the crowd will clap for the wrong reasons. Sometimes the crowd will misunderstand. And sometimes the crowd will project. Sometimes the crowd will idolize you. Sometimes the crowd will turn on you. So applause cannot be the metric, because the crowd is not the conscience. Alignment must be the metric. Integrity must be the metric. Containment must be the metric. So what do I do with being seen? I do the adult thing. I do not perform. I do not posture. I do not make myself a myth. I do not use my story to demand admiration. I do not use my suffering to buy status. I speak carefully. I speak soberly. And I let time prove stability. Because the only thing that heals cringe is not actually explanation. It is the consistency. Let's go deeper. Because the cringe isn't just social. It is existential. It is the fact that when you have been in those states, you can feel like you committed social suicide. Like you died in front of people. Like the person you used to be evaporated into thin air. And in a way, it did. There is a path few people name because it sounds too stark. Some lives are stripped before physical death. Not symbolically. Not metaphorically. Literally. Identity dies early. Belonging dies early. Future fantasies die early. The image of who I was supposed to be dies early. And from the outside, it can look like failure. addiction, psychosis, prison, humiliation, loss of direction, loss of reputation, loss of certainty. It can look like the life went wrong. And there is another way to describe it. And it is not pretty. It is not Instagram spirituality. It is not motivational. It is the language of ash. A forest fire tears through everything. It does not negotiate. It does not ask permission. It burns what was dry. It burns what was false. It burns what could not survive heat. And afterwards, what is left is not success. What is left is ground. Smoldering ground. Silent and bare. Because when you are there, you are not heroic. You are not wise. You are not a teacher. You are lost, infantile, terrified, living in fear, ashamed. And sometimes you just want to die just to escape the weight of being alive. So what happens next? What else than to rebuild? Slowly, awkwardly, embarrassingly. You rebuild your spine. You rebuild your routines. You rebuild your relationships. You rebuild your capacity to be in the world without drama. And yes, one day the lotus may grow. One day people may see beauty. One day people may admire the result. But here is the thing. They might never know what it actually cost. They might never know the depth of the prayer, the depth of the pain, the depth of the sacrifice, the black hole, the abyss. But you will, I will, and that is enough. Let's say something else that matters. Even the lotus perishes. Even the healed man dies. Even the rebuilt life ends. So the question becomes, what do you take with you? What remains when everything is stripped? What remains when the applause ends? What remains when the body fails? What remains when you reach the threshold we all reach at death? This is where the path becomes spiritual again, but in a sober way, not in a bypass way, in a grounded way. Because when you have been stripped early, you start living as if death is not theoretical. It is close. And you start asking the only questions that really, truly matter. What is true? What is lawful? What is aligned? What is worth carrying across the final threshold? And that leads us into the metaphysical knot. Were you a puppet pulled on strings? Were you moved by forces beyond your control? And here is the only answer that does not collapse into ideology. I was not a puppet, and I was not fully in control. Both are true. There were currents in my life, psychological inheritances, biological vulnerabilities, trauma, shame, timing, open doors, environments that amplified me, substances that lowered boundaries and inhibitions, spiritual intensity that flooded my psyche. All of that is real, and pretending it isn't real is naive and foolish. But here is the other truth. I made choices. I chose environments. I chose substances. I chose intensity. I chose proximity to fire. Sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously, sometimes compulsively, sometimes with prayer, sometimes with self-destruction disguised as devotion. There are shadows, there are compulsions, there are parts of us that sabotage. There are parts that we do not understand, cannot, and never will. And if you frame those as demons, you may not be completely wrong in the symbolic sense, in the mythic sense. But here is the adult line. Even if demons exist, your responsibility remains. You are answerable for what you do with your life. You are answerable for harm. You are answerable for boundaries. You are answerable for law. You are answerable for containment. If you start blaming forces for your actions, you are avoiding adulthood. And adulthood is the real initiation. Yes, the mystery is real. Yes, there may be a larger architecture. Yes, there may be karmic currents. Yes, there may be something orchestrated, but none of that gives you permission to cross the line. None of that sanctifies harm. None of that absolves you from repair. None of that turns violence into initiation. None of that makes predation a rite of passage. None of that cancels consequence. And if you use it to justify those things, you may not return. And you may die down there in the labyrinth. And this is where I want to speak directly to the part of me and the part of you watching this that longs for cosmic meaning. The part that wants the suffering to be recorded, to be seen, to be registered, to be remembered, to be worth something. That part is unmistakably human, and it's also dangerous because meaning hunger can become another drug, a quieter drug than cannabis, a quieter drug than grandiosity, but just as addictive. It whispers, if it was all orchestrated, then I am special. If it was all planned, then I am chosen. If I suffered like this, then I deserve something. And this is where a man has to be disciplined. Because if you let meaning, hunger inflate identity, you will repeat the cycle. You will start walking back toward the edge. Not because you want the pain, because you want the significance. So what is the adult move? The adult move is to accept mystery without demanding a crown, to love God without using God, to carry fire without burning the village, to be grateful for survival without turning survival into another entitlement, to accept that some things were bigger than you and still say, I am wholly and truly responsible for my life. Now we need to talk about the real world integration, where modernity fails, where ancient cultures would fail, and what a sober framework looks like now. Part of what I've lived through is not just a personal story. It is a structural story. A story about what happens when a man is flooded and what happens where there is no place for him to go that can hold both ends of the spectrum, the meaning and the risk. Let's start with modernity. Modern psychiatry has strengths, real strengths. When someone is disorganized, hallucinating, paranoid, suicidal, violent, unable to track consequence, psychiatry can save lives. Containment can save lives. Medication can sometimes save lives. Hospitalization can sometimes save lives. Boundaries enforced from the outside can sometimes save lives. And it's important I say that plainly and clearly, because there is a whole corner of spiritual culture that likes to treat psychiatry as the enemy. That is immature and childish. That is ideological. That is dangerous. But modern psychiatry also has a limitation, a major one. It is not designed for mythic language. It is not designed for initiatory pressure. It is not designed to hold cosmology. It is designed to reduce symptoms, to stabilize behavior, to prevent harm, to manage risk. And when you come in speaking about spiritual warfare, spiritual attack, spiritual calling, ancestor work, deities, visions, the system does not know what to do with that. So what does it do? It collapses the entire language into pathology. It treats the language itself as evidence. It treats meaning as delusion. It treats cosmology as a symptom. And sometimes it does that even when parts of the language are actually describing real psychological mechanisms. Trauma, disassociation, nervous system overwhelm, addiction, pressure, identity fracture, archetypal flooding. So the system has one hammer and everything starts looking like a nail. Here is the danger. If you reduce everything to pathology, you might stabilize someone in the short term, but you might also erase the part of them that gives them a reason to return. You might keep them alive and also take away their meaning. And if a man loses his meaning, he might still die, just slower, through addiction, through isolation, through suicide, through self-destruction, through spiritual cynicism, through becoming an empty shell. So modernity can hold symptoms, but it often cannot hold soul. Let's go the other way. Let's talk about ancient spirituality, because it is where people get romantic. Real lineages are not naive. Real lineages are structured. Real lineages are harsh when they need to be harsh, because they understand something modern spirituality forgets. Fire is not a vibe. Fire is law. Fire burns. And if a man is unstable, uncontained, dangerous, the village cannot pretend it is all awakening. The village has to survive. Children have to survive. Women have to survive. Elders have to survive. Continuity has to survive. So intact cultures had containment. They had rules. They had authority. They had consequences. They did not let a man roam free just because he was a visionary. They did not excuse violence as spiritual. They did not worship instability. They tested. They observed. They intervened. They removed people when necessary. Sometimes they restrained them. Sometimes they exiled them. Sometimes they isolated them. Sometimes they held a man away from the community until he could return safely. And sometimes, let's be honest, some people did not return. Some people broke. Some people died. Not because the culture was evil, because the edge is real. Here is the crucial point. Most of us are not living in intact cultures. We are living in modernity. which means the worst possible thing happens. We import ancient language without the ancient containment. We import shaman talk without elder authority. We import initiation rhetoric without laws. We import medicine path identity without the village. So people walk around talking like mystics while living like fragmented addicts. They claim initiation while refusing accountability. They call breakdown awakening while harming others. They call delusion truth while becoming unsafe. And that is not spirituality. That is a lack of containment. And that is chaos dressed in spiritual clothing. So neither system alone is sufficient. Psychiatry alone can flatten the soul. Spirituality alone, without structure, can romanticize danger. And both can and will kill. So what do we need? We need integration. And I don't mean a slogan. I mean a framework. Medical containment, spiritual discernment, legal accountability, community protection, all at the same time. Let me make it practical. If a man is unstable, you stabilize first. Sleep, food, structure, sobriety, boundaries, support. The immediate question is not spiritual meaning. It is safety. And once safety is present, then you can begin asking about meaning. But meaning is never allowed to cancel consequence. Ever. That's the rail. And this is where I want to say something that might upset both camps. A man walking the edge must be answerable. Not to his visions, not to his feelings, not to his mythic story. Answerable to law, the elders, if he has any. Answerable to real boundaries. Answerable to reality. Answerable to the harm he causes. Answerable to his own nervous system. Answerable to sobriety. Answerable to consequences. Without that, the edge consumes him. And consumption is not awakening. Now, let's bridge into the last traps. Because once a man starts to stabilize, meaning hunger comes back. And the story tries to rebuild itself. And this is where the ambassador fantasy appears, because it touches a sincere longing and also a dangerous temptation. The longing is simple. I want this to mean something. He makes it back. He builds a spine. He regains containment. He becomes sober. He becomes lawful. Because you saw the edge, you should be honored and heralded. Because you were close to God, you must be an ambassador of Him. This is the last trap, because it rebuilds the identity, but this time with spiritual language. And spiritual identity inflation is the most seductive kind, because it feels holy. It feels like service. It feels like destiny. And it can still be ego. Just cleaner, just quieter, just better dressed. Ancient cultures knew this. That is why in real initiation, the stripping happens again after return. No titles, no proclamations, no spiritual ranking, no mythology, just work, just service, just sobriety. Because the real ambassador doesn't announce himself. The real healer doesn't need cosmic validation. The real initiate doesn't need to be crowned. He can love God and still remain grounded. He can carry mystery and still obey law. He can hold fire and still refuse to burn the village. So here is what I will say, and I'm not here to pretend certainty, but I do know this. If I live my life trying to earn cosmic applause, I will become spiritually corrupt, because I will start doing good work for the wrong reasons. I will start needing validation. I will start bargaining again. I will start turning suffering into entitlement. And entitlement is the seed of relapse. So the adult move is this. I can hold the hope without making it the motive. I can hold the mystery without building an identity around it. I can pray without demanding a crown. I can serve without needing to be special. That is sovereignty. That is adulthood. That is containment. And if you are watching this and you recognize the ambassador fantasy, I am not judging you. I am warning you, because the fantasy is understandable and the fantasy can still destroy you. You do not need cosmic rank. You need ground. You need law. You need sobriety. You need service that does not inflate the self. That is the real work. Now we come to the final movement, not as a dramatic ending, but as a ground, the ground that holds. There is no final enlightenment here, no cosmic certificate, no angelic applause, no dramatic resolution, just ground. The kind that holds weight. The kind that does not move under pressure. The kind that does not need to explain itself. This is what the Edge taught me. The work is not to prove my experience was sacred. The work is to become the kind of man who can carry the sacred without becoming dangerous. To hold fire without burning others. To hold vision without violating reality. To hold God without using God. And I want to return to the line one last time, because this is the ethical center of the whole episode. Spiritual meaning does not cancel consequence. Ever. Not in India, not in a temple, not in a psych ward, not in a ceremony, not in prophecy, not in dreams, not in visions, not in karma, not in God talk, not in devil talk, not in anything. Consequence is the rail. If I violate the rail, I am not spiritual. I am dangerous. So what do I do now? I do the quiet things. I build structure. I stay sober. I honor my nervous system. I respect law. I take responsibility. I do not perform my trauma. I do not romanticize the edge. I do not invite people to copy chaos. I do not use my story as an excuse. I do not use spirituality to bypass repair. I keep my life small enough to be stable, and I let the work grow from there, slowly, organically, without spectacle. And I want to speak directly to the men watching this. If you are on the edge, if you are flirting with instability, if you are telling yourself it is destiny, if you are using substances while you are flooded, if you are neglecting sleep and structure, if you are becoming grandiose, if you are becoming paranoid, if you are losing consequence tracking, hear me. This is not romance. This is risk. And the bravest thing you can do is not to jump further into the underworld. The bravest thing you can do is stabilize, contain, get help, tell the truth to someone real. Take the medicine if you need it. Sleep, eat, stop using drugs that amplify you. Get grounded, because the point is not to stay at the edge. The point is to return. And if you have already survived, if you have already come back, if you are carrying shame, carrying social death, carrying social suicide, carrying the memory of being seen at your very worst, I want to say this to you. You do not rebuild by explaining. You rebuild by living consistently, with humility, with lawfulness. Time restores trust. Time restores your sacred spine. Time is what restores sovereignty. And if one day this work reaches more people beyond my small channel right now, if one day the channel grows, if one day the story becomes public, I want it to be for one reason. Not because madness was holy, but because containment was restored. Not because chaos was destiny, but because responsibility was reclaimed. Not because I want to be special, but because I want to serve something real, quietly, lawfully, without spectacle. So that is the complete episode. Not as a myth, as a map, a sober map for anyone walking near that edge. The edge is real. The consequences are real. And the line is real. Hold the line. Come back. And keep coming back. Because that is the work. And it continues.